thank you very much for the invitation. I've been looking forward to this since I knew that this was going to happen this week. I'm going to talk about transactional ministries of finance and policy ministries of finance. This is mainly based on one paper that I'm working on, but it is also connected to other bits and pieces of work that are sort of bleeding together and blending together. And so I'm very happy to take the conversation at the end in whatever direction seems most interested and most suitable to you. But I'm also very keen to get feedback on what it is that I'm talking about now, because none of this is locked in stone, and so your reaction and gut feeling is going to be quite valuable. So let me get going then. I want to start off with a couple of definitions, and I think this is for me this has been quite important because I've been working on public sector management and public finance management for a fair bit of time. And in this profession, there are certain established ways of looking at a public finance system. And in particular, you spend a lot of time, as is, I guess, natural for people to look at the tools and instruments that you use as a ministry or as an official to interact with the world. And people spend a lot of time thinking about how do we want to structure our budget? How do we organize a budget calendar? If we have a fiscal rule, how do we design a fiscal rule? All of that is interesting and it has a lot of merit. And you can't live without that. But if this is the only way that you look at a ministry of finance, you're definitely missing something. And my point of departure here is that, of course, I'm interested in the public finance system, the administration of it, and the policy of it. But I'm also very interested in the Ministry of Finance as a ministry that sits in central government and in almost every country in the world is subject to the same civil service regulations, to the same constitutional and legal requirements, and so on. And in many important ways, the person who goes to work in the Ministry of Finance is a civil servant first and a public finance person second, if second. And so the first set of things, just to clarify, is this question of policy. So when I think about policy, I'm not just talking about policy in the sense of a law that is being passed, that sort of sets out work in a new sector and in some ways sort of sets the terms of how is this area of government supposed to work henceforth. But policy has a lot more nuance to it and covers a much wider set of things. So the sort of very generic definition that I'm using here, the principle or guideline applied to a decision or an action, which means what are the underlying things that we bring to bear when we make a day-to-day decision in our work. And so that can be laws or regulations, secondary legislation, and so on and so forth. It can be strategies, it can be plans, it can be the design of a program, or it can be something as relatively informal as what is our approach to X? What is our take on this? And so there's a difference in government between a policy decision, which is something that politicians do, and policy work, which involves the entire underpinnings of policy happening, public policy happening in government. And so I'm using here a sort of a very generic distinction, which is policy production, policy maintenance, and policy support. All of those are important to varying degrees. So it's not just about the drafting, it's also about the maintaining of policy, which is to make sure that policies are being complied with, that they are updated on a regular basis, that if something happens out there in the world, you probably have different policies that are pertinent. How do you then, as a government, make sure that those are not mutually inconsistent? And if they are, which often they are, how do you negotiate? Which policy takes precedent? How do you hash out the differences and so on? And the complexity of that is not to be underestimated. So that's the first set of definitions. Second set of definitions. What do I mean by Ministry of Finance? What do I mean by a transactional Ministry of Finance and a policy Ministry of Finance? So in very generic terms, Ministry of Finance is the custodian of public money. Part of the core executive in modern times, in policy terms, is usually in charge of aggregate fiscal policy, expenditure or budget policy, and revenue or tax policy. So you can think of it as a triangle like that. And normally this is organized around the role that the Ministry of Finance plays in the budget process. In practice, of course, in a lot of countries, there are different ways that this can be sliced up. So you don't necessarily have to have only one Ministry of Finance. You can have multiples, and you can have a division of labor between ministries of finance that are sensible and ones that are less sensible, depending on how procedurally well those divisions are then organized. And in addition to expenditure, revenue policy, and aggregate fiscal policy, ministries of finance tend to take on a whole bunch of other things, and I'm going to come to that in a second. Some of which are fairly common, some other things are not so common. In my way of thinking about this, I would say that 100 years ago, every Ministry of Finance in the world was a transactional Ministry of Finance. Which means that the staff of the Ministry of Finance are primarily concerned with controlling and, in some cases, processing financial transactions in government as they are happening, which is to say, they look at the flow of tax payments as they are coming in. Then they concern themselves with the flow of money through the government, and then they think about the release of funds on the expenditure side as the money is moving to expenditure units, i.e. spending departments, and then ultimately the schools or whatever that actually process the money out, and everything that happens in between. If you look at your, let's say, 1900 Ministry of Finance, then this managing of the money, the transactional function of the Ministry of Finance is what most staff are paying attention to. Historically, there's very good reasons for this, because it's actually something that is quite difficult to get a grasp on. And if you look into the medieval origins of where ministries of finance came from a long, long time ago in those countries which had them for a long, long time, then you can imagine that, if there's a reinforced chest full of gold coins that is moving into the treasury, which is why it's often called that, and is then being dispersed out of the treasury on the other side, the question of record keeping and making sure that the money is being paid out for what it is intended to be paid out, and so on and so forth, is primary. If you haven't got that, then not much else really makes a whole lot of sense. But over time, the level of policy that is happening in governments, in central governments, in like modern times, has been increasing by, leaps and bounds, exponentially, however you want to think about this. And so some ministries of finance have moved from being primarily a custodian of individual financial transactions to much more a custodian of what is our approach to X? How do we think about policy in this area that is the domain of the Ministry of Finance, which has a whole bunch of implications, as in to move from this state, ideal state or stereotype or whatever, to the other state means that there's different kinds of people doing different kinds of work in an organization that often has a different structure with different internal operating procedures, different sets of priorities, different things that the organization cares about, and so on. And in the beginning, something that really motivated me to explore this question further was actually the different flavor that you experience if you go to different ministries of finance across the world, where there's some ministries of finance. If you go to the budget office in particular as a visitor, then you find that the entire hallway is awash with people going back and forth. And somebody who is a civil servant in the budget office has a queue of people waiting outside. And if you're meeting them and you're talking to them for half an hour, you probably find that there's now 3 times as much of a queue greeting you outside, getting mildly irritated with the fact that you have just interrupted the flow of things that was needed to happen there. And those people are there physically, and the phone keeps on ringing all the time, because those are people from spending units, spending departments who are asking about authorizations for environments, or authorizations for cash releases, a question about a problem with this project here, a question about a problem with this project there, everything that needs to be changed, and a lot of things that are completely routine involve one-off attention from the budget office. If you're visiting the Treasury in the UK, or the National Treasury in South Africa is another example, or the German Ministry of Finance, the hallways are completely quiet. And the only thing that moves around the building is files. There is no more of that traffic of people, because that ministry trades in policy. It doesn't trade in a million little tiny small decisions day in and day out. And so how you get from here to there is something that I think is profoundly interesting, and there's not a lot that has been written about this. And so I'm going to take you through a couple of different aspects of how I'm now trying to grasp this issue. The final thing by way of definitions is I'm going to refer a lot to professionals versus technicians versus clerical staff. This is actually something that the ILO has a set of fairly standardized definitions, and in a lot of countries, job descriptions in the public sector map onto a version of this sort of generic set of things. And so when I talk about professional staff, you are thinking of people who have professional training, have master's degrees or similar, and usually policy staff are professional staff. Technicians and associate professionals, those can be people who come into the civil service through a variety of training, but they wouldn't have master's degrees. They might have some kind of sort of first level university degrees. Very often they are actually trained after they've joined government up to a similar level of proficiency, and those would be the people for you who, for instance, sitting in an office and are processing transactions. managing the compliance, working through the checklists, and moving paper through the office at a sort of rapid clip. And then, of course, you have clerical support, which is something which in the olden days you would have lots of people who basically take on a secretariat function in the literal sense of the word. And nowadays you have fewer and fewer of those because we have emails now. So in an ideal type scenario, this is what your transactional Ministry of Finance looks like and what your policy Ministry of Finance looks like. I'm not going to go through all of this because it is a lot of text, but just a couple of highlights essentially to make clear where I see the main distinction. So the first thing is that whether you are a transactional ministry or a policy ministry, your ministry is always going to do policy work. There's always going to be a certain amount of policy questions that are being run into the ministry no matter what. And that was true 100 years ago. It's much more the case today, but it is never not the case, because in any functionally specialized organization in government, there's a certain amount of questions that have a legislative dimension to it and that involve questions such as, what is our view on this thing? And how should we position ourselves vis-a-vis that? In a transactional ministry, this policy function is one that is basically taken up by middle management and senior management. So it's the person of the minister, and then it's the person of the sort of two or three layers below the minister in the civil service, who do the managing of the organization, manage the budget, manage the staff, keep the trains running on time, and then the policy work as it comes into the organization, you do that on top of everything else. And the self-understanding of these people used to be very strongly that you need to be on the other side of 20 years of sort of a civil service career. You need to be fairly close to the apex of the organization to be trusted with policy work and to be capable of making those sorts of decisions. Because a lot of it at a certain point then relies on experience and tacit knowledge, not formal knowledge and formal training. And I can think of a lot of places where I've worked personally where the Ministry of Finance could be 5,000 people, and the minister would have maybe a handful who could be trusted to deal with complex problems, could be trusted to be sent off to talk to the delegation from the IMF, those sorts of things. And so in terms of the organizational setup, as soon as the amount of policy work starts to increase, the organization very quickly then reaches the limits of its ability to cope with those sorts of things. Because then those 5 people or 10 or 15 start to get very, very busy. And then soon they have to make trade-off choices about, do I think about this policy problem or do I deal with the very, very urgent issue that my minister just sent down to me, which is to the customs office is screaming about a thing that has just happened that was in the newspapers yesterday and it needs my attention. And then things start to get dropped. The transactional ministry has a lot of people who are very good at what they do. And so if you talk to people in the public finance profession, it is very easy to fall into these rote stereotypes that there are traditional ministries and modern ministries, whereas a traditional ministry, it looks a little bit like one that focuses on transactions, and the modern ministry is the one with all the computers and where people have master's degrees from international universities and so on. And those are the places that get stuff done. I don't think of it that way at all. If you that transactional ministry can become very good at what it does because somebody needs to do those sorts of transactional controls. And so the accountants or desk officers or whatever they're called, can be incredibly professional in the broader sense of the word, even if they haven't got advanced university degrees and so on, and they just know how to make stuff happen, and that is not nothing. In fact, in a lot of countries, you wish you had a ministry that was able to do this transactional function well, and many of them don't. Whereas if you then move over to more of a policy orientation, then what tends to happen, and I'm going to get to that more in a second, is that many of these transactional functions with time are being delegated to other parts of government. They are automated, or they're outsourced. And what I mean by outsourcing here is not necessarily to a private company, but to subordinate agencies. So spending authority, you might delegate that, and you're saying, Ministry of Health, maybe I haven't got to put my signature on every cash release in excess of, 50 rupees or whatever the amount is. Maybe we can increase that margin by a factor of 10, and we trust you not to waste all of that money if we delegate some more authority to you. Whereas the outsourcing would be to say, instead of having a gigantic tax administration department, can we create an agency that is then operated at arm's length? It's not part of the core ministry anymore. And then we separate between the administration of tax and tax policy. Tax policy stays in the ministry. Tax administration goes off someplace else. And again, you do that when you have a certain degree of faith in the idea that once you move them across the road, then you don't, that distance and lack of access into day-to-day operational decisions is not then causing you an endless stream of nightmares because suddenly you don't know exactly what's going on in you. And then you start to find yourself in a position where you can staff up on the policy side. How that happens is actually not trivial at all. It's actually probably the most interesting thing about this whole question that I found. So I don't want to get too much into this question of the functions of the Ministry of Finance, but because if you're not interested in this is the part that gets very boring very quickly, and so we haven't got to. But it's essentially just a little bit of a mapping of what are the things that we think a Ministry of Finance needs to do in order to be called a Ministry of Finance, and what are the things that the Ministry of Finance may often do or actually find very beneficial to do so that nobody else does it, but you are not debilitating the functioning of the Ministry of Finance and if somebody else does it. And so one of these, for instance, is macro forecasting, so like tax forecasting, inflation forecasting, and so on, and coming up with your growth forecast in the Ministry of Finance. Another thing would be monetary policy, sort of the classic thing. If the Ministry of Finance stops doing monetary policy and there's a central bank that is independent or semi-independent, it doesn't really affect the operating of fiscal policy very much. But that doesn't mean that the Ministry of Finance is in all cases convinced that they really want to do that, because delegating things and outsourcing things always involve a certain loss of control, and those are decisions that are not being taken lightly, and not being taken lightly by anyone, especially not taken lightly by people in the Ministry of Finance. So you have these two core functions, which are the budgetary core. That's the place where you do revenue work and you do expenditure work. And then you have the macro fiscal core, where the work on setting aggregate fiscal policy takes place. In a transactional Ministry of Finance, cash management, debt management, tax administration, customs administration, that's where probably 90% of your people are going to sit. Unfortunately, the world in which we live is not one where countries have decided on a common standard for civil service and central government statistics. And so what is considered to be part of the core ministry and what is considered to be a subordinate agency or a separate department. Of course, every country has their own definition on what is sort of in and out, but at the same time, in every country, there's also usually a sense of this is the core ministry and this is some other thing. Even if the core ministry is more of a loose confederation of fairly independent departments, there's sort of a core, and then there's the periphery, and the periphery does the administrative part. And things like cash management, for instance, like managing the accounting function in the day-to-day, the recording and so on of transactions, that can be a hugely, it's obviously time-consuming. And if you do it on a paper basis, it's enormously time-consuming, and it requires a lot of attention. And so you can have hallways and hallways full of officials who are doing nothing but those things. I was looking at the statistics for Germany recently, and a century ago in 1923, on the cash management side. So basically the managing of like payments, but then also the internal flow of funds through the government. In Germany at the national level, the national treasury was about 20,000 staff in 1923, I think. Together, and today that number is 10. And
10,000.
No, 10. 10 people. So the national cash office, that the office that manages the flow, like the daily flow of funds, and manages the treasury single account system, essentially, what in India would be the PFMS, I guess. That it's been shrinking, and it became, about 20 years ago, it became so small that people decided that we don't even need to have a national office for this, and is now basically a unit that is tucked into the central administration of the customs office. And it's sort of 15 people. It might be a few more, but it's sort of multiple orders of magnitude of automation, delegation, and so on that made this function basically completely disappear because it's not needed anymore. Yes, you can, please.
All of this, if you think about the transactional finance ministry and the ministry of finance versus the policy, does some part of it is it just column 1, 2, and the transactions that sit with the transaction ministry? Or is there all of it in one?
So the transactional functions never go away. And where it sits in the organization is then sort of a question of organizational choice. And so in the policy ministry, these functions are still there, and they are still in the remit of the Ministry of Finance, but they might have become so small that you barely notice them. And you wouldn't, in a transactional ministry, if you look at the org chart of the organization, it won't take you long to find the cash management function on the organizational chart. And in the UK today or in Germany today, if you don't know where to look, you'll miss it. But that doesn't mean that it's no longer there. I've started now to look into this sort of distribution of functions across different countries. Like I said, this is an absolute pain because it's very, very hard to find comparable data. And the way that organizations report information on staff numbers and on org charts and functional distributions and the allocation of responsibilities within the organization is A, difficult to find, and B, is then difficult to make comparable. But just to give you an idea that, in some of these countries today, this sort of budget policy, as in revenue expenditure policy plus aggregate fiscal policy, those core policy functions, that's probably already somewhere between a third and half of the organization. And then on top of that come other functions that are also there, procurement policy. If there is a financial sector role for the government, for the Ministry of Finance, and that doesn't sit with some other ministry, then those are staff-intensive and quite sizable policy functions. Plus. And so it adds up and it adds up. Amongst this completely, there's, I would like to tell you that these countries have been carefully selected for their representativeness and the special characteristics that they exemplify. Of course, that is completely not true. Those are just countries that I have been able to get sort of access to data and information, and I'm now trying to get some mileage out of trying to work through whether these comparisons are sort of meaningful and they tell me something interesting. But these are all countries so South Africa, Germany, and the UK in particular that are quite far along that path. Romania after 2011 actually changed itself quite a bit more. And so today, Romania would be looking differently. But if you look at just purely sort of offices and units that are clearly about some type of transactional work, then that is the bright yellow. And so you have a bit of that in Romania, you have a bit of that in Mexico. Most of the time nowadays, it's either so small that it's just tucked under some other place, or it's been handed off to other parts of the organization. And I think the tendency and the pressure to also get rid of policy functions that are not central to the mandate of the Ministry of Finance is also something that has been increasing especially over the last 30 years or so, where the question raises itself inside the ministry. Is that something that we really have to do here? Or is it technical enough, or maybe just off, sort of out of the core enough that we can hand this off to someplace else? And so that I think you're also going to, if you have more data for changes over time, more data for differences between countries, then you're going to see that there's an increasing focus on policy, but also within policy, then there's an increasing focus on things that are actually quite central to what the Ministry of Finance needs to do, and other things that are so slowly wandering off into other places. Now, how might change happen? There are a couple of things here, and this is fairly blue skies at this point, I would say. So this isn't based on a large data set, nothing of that sort. It's fairly speculative. I think, I am fairly confident that this isn't, that this is going to hold up, but it's still very much work in progress. And so I think there are a couple of things, and I'm going to work my way up this list in reverse order. There are external and internal demands that are much more to do with how does government work, that determine the amount of policy work that just falls onto the Ministry of Finance. Because like I said, there's been a secular change over the course, and you can over the course of the last 20 years, 50 years, in particular, where because of economic integration, the increasing complexity of the work that government does, external demands that are being placed on the government, but also internal demands that are being placed on the government that have created pressure to do more policy work. If you look at countries in a development context nowadays, you it's difficult to escape the demand for you to engage with issues in a systematic, structured, policy-like manner, rather than doing everything in an ad hoc way, because you are part of an international system where your professional peers, whether it be the IMF or the World Bank, regional organizations, European Union is tremendously important in this regard. They are going to show up on your doorstep every now and then, and they're going to send you a paper to review, and they're going to ask you for your policy position on this and that. And so even if you didn't care about this one iota, you still have to engage with it a whole lot more than you used to back in the olden days. The availability of qualified policy staff, so people who could do the work that you can get off the market, is clearly an important factor and an important consideration. I would think that today this is much less of an issue than it used to be in a lot of places, because even in lower middle income and in a lot of lower income countries, you are going to be able to hire people who have secondary degrees in public policy, economics, or law, or whatever it is that you recruit your senior civil service from. And this is a constraint that is a lot more fuzzy and a lot softer than it used to be. There's a lot more nowadays about the retention of qualified staff and the motivation of qualified staff, rather than this issue of that you found in the 1960s, in the immediate aftermath of decolonization, where you would say, we have sort of 3 highly qualified civil servants. If we pull them all into the Ministry of Finance, then nobody else in the public sector gets access to this very, very, very scarce resource. If you come across people who have been working internationally in this field, I think there's often an assumption that nothing has changed in this space, and that it's very, very hard to find anybody with advanced degrees and so on, when in reality, of course, the supply of qualified staff in OECD countries is a different story from low-income countries, but those constraints, I think, are easing. And then the final thing here is the size and complexity of the public sector, which is, of course, something that, like if you read into that, not just economic growth sort of as such, but also the wider effects of economic transformation, technological change and progress, and so on, then it's not hard to see how, if you're an agricultural economy, then the number of policy questions that might land on your desk is vastly smaller than the number of policy questions that are going to end up with the Ministry of Finance if you're like a modern, diversified, high-income economy where a lot of work is being done in services, where the sorts of questions that are being asked that need to be regulated and where norms need to be set are just of a completely different order of magnitude. Those 4 apply to every ministry in central government to some extent. You could put this list into a Ministry of Justice or Ministry of Health, and by and large, you would come to a similar set of things. It's not obvious, though, that these policy decisions and policy issues need to rest with the Ministry of Finance. So the big issue is about expenditure, revenue, and fiscal. Theoretically, some other part of the government could do it, or could try and do it. And historically, there are a lot of countries where other parts of the government have tried to do it. And the fact that the Ministry of Finance is establishing itself as that sort of counterweight, the cash conserving counterweight that sets policy so that spending units get to go on doing what it is that they do, is not a foregone conclusion. And my sense is that there are two things that need to happen in order for that to work, that sort of transition to work. And the first one is that the transactional Ministry of Finance needs to be successful in establishing the budget as the central arena to settle policy priorities. That sounds very boring, but I think is actually both meaningful and very interesting, because if the budget sticks, barring any unforeseen circumstances, and the unforeseen circumstances are themselves subject to the budget code, the budget law, and so on. So that, earthquakes happen, pandemics can start during the fiscal year, historically have not complied to the requirement that it would be nice if those sorts of things always happened at the beginning of budget negotiations. That's just the way it is. But then the budget can provide for those things. There's ways that you can deal with emergency expenditures and under-year contingencies that are provided. But as long as there's no space in government where you can make policy decisions that exist outside of the budget process, then the main centralizing fight that the Ministry of Finance has to fight has been won, because then the Ministry of Finance can determine how policy questions are being settled by determining how the budget process is organized and how that is structured. The moment that you feel like you're coming to an agreement with your very powerful Minister of Health, who is maybe from a different political party, and you've negotiated on the budget for 3 months and everything is now settled, it goes through cabinet, the budget is then passed through the legislature a couple of weeks later, the fiscal year starts, and on day one of the fiscal year, the Ministry of Health then decides, well, I mean, the budget is sort of rough guidance, but really we can start varying funds right now. And why don't we move some of those capital funds and start procuring more cars instead of medical supplies, or whatever the thing might be? We were supposed to finish that bridge. Why don't we just go ahead and start another bridge now? And if you lose control of those sorts of things, then the budget isn't the only place where you can make policy decisions, because during implementation, you come to a different set of policy decisions. And at the end of the year, you then find that policy as enacted is vastly different from policy as it's been decided. Of course, that gap is always there, and it's sort of part of modern government, that you shouldn't overemphasize policy as it's being made on paper. But this is much more about what is the role of the budget process in that, and how can you make sure that these decisions are sticky. Once you have passed that point, then as a Ministry of Finance, you would be able to say, maybe we can relax a little bit on how much time and attention we devote to transactional controls. And I think, Susan, that goes back to your question. That doesn't mean that you stop exercising this control. It just means that you're exercising it with to use a non-technical term, you can be a little bit less paranoid about it in the day-to-day. And you can have a degree of comfort that automation, delegation, and so on can sort of work their way without you ever not being paranoid about it. And I think that's also important to keep in mind. None of this is irreversible at all. And I spent quite a bit of time looking at countries in Europe in the last year or so, and it's in I would say that these conditions 1 or 2 in the UK fully met. You can argue whether that was in the 70s or in the 80s, but it's within a lot of people's lifetimes. This is not ancient history at all. And when I started out working in public finance, which was when Gordon Brown was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and people internationally sort of thought that everything in Britain was the model to be learned from in a sort of very advanced new public management sort of way, whereby you don't control for inputs anymore. You control for outcomes. You delegate authority to spending departments and reach multi-year settlements. And those multi-year settlements are over public service targets. They are not over the question of how much are you going to spend on salary versus capital and all those sorts of things. We now know that almost as soon as some of these reforms were being enacted, the fight started again, where spending departments then realize, well, if we have that flexibility, then we can start getting tricky about it. And if there are loopholes, let's start exploiting those loopholes. And within a decade, I think, if you compare to 2000 to 2010, many of these things at a sort of very minute administrative level have actually been rolled back. There was a very important study on the history of HM Treasury that came out, a book that came out in 2023 that essentially tells that story. And there's a sort of a paper in there that is about who loves input controls and where did this output orientation go, essentially. And it just didn't last very long, because if you stop paying attention to this, you're going to get punished very, very quickly. Is sort of the paranoid interpretation of this. Of course, it's never quite as stark, but this is something that you definitely find. Now, a couple of more things about the empirical side, which is about, if you look at Germany, again, I'm looking at Germany actually not because I am German and I think this is sort of the be all and end all, but just because I know where to find the data, and I've been able to get very good information out of the archives covering a sort of a century of history, and so it's just a good place to look. So this is the German Ministry of Finance, starting from 1920, when the first proper national Ministry of Finance was set up in Germany, through the 1920s and 30s. This is the time when Germany was very much a transactional Ministry of Finance. And so you have sort of a ratio of 1 to 10. You have a ministry, that is the yellow dotted line, dashed line. You have a ministry that is about 1,000 staff, of which about 100 or so, give or take, are policy staff. Germany has had, and still does to this day, a segmented civil service, by which I mean that you have these sort of civil service classes. There's the higher civil service, there's the somewhat less high civil service, there's the middle civil service, and the lower civil service. If you are a higher civil servant, traditionally you have to be a lawyer, as in a jurist, trained up to the highest legal qualification that the country has to offer, which means that anyone who is a higher civil servant who comes through the legal track technically could become, is qualified to be a judge, is qualified to be a prosecutor, as in the highest offices for people with legal qualifications. There's no distinction between that and a higher civil servant. And so those people there's, it's Germany likes its lawyers, especially the public sector, but and so I would say there is a limited supply. That supply isn't minuscule, but that ratio of 1 to 10 is one that you probably find in a lot of countries. And what's important here is that distinction between these civil service classes has never changed. As in, to this day, there's a higher civil service, and there's a very limited set of paths and avenues from a lower civil service class to be promoted into a higher civil service class. And the norm, because theoretically you would have to go back to university and get a higher university degree than you did before. And there are civil service colleges and so on, and so there are ways that you can do that. But if you enter as a there's a funny the higher civil service, and then there's the elevated civil service, I guess. The expectation would be that the majority of people in these civil service classes start their career and end their career there. And you can have a 30-year career in that civil service band unless you go through a very rigid process of qualifications. You're not going to get promoted into the higher levels. In the post-war history, then, that is where you see the Ministry of Finance itself is getting bigger, of course. So, it's been around the sort of 1700 to 2000 mark for quite some time. It's also, this is not an order of magnitude increase or anything like that. This has basically doubled in size over the course of a century. But the ratio of policy staff, instead of being 10%, nowadays is between 60 and 70%.
Just curious, when reunification happened,
yes,
did the GDR staff get adopted as FRG staff, or were they just given a golden handshake and told to leave?
A lot of them were moved over.
I don't see a surge.
Yes. So the surge that you're seeing there in the total numbers from no, that's the one that
it should have happened on reunification day.
Yes, but it does. So that, do you see that the last increase that goes through the 1990s, that's where it happens. And so it's true that it didn't happen from one year to the next. That process took some time, but it definitely did happen. And it also happened because there actually, like a lot of those staff were absorbed at lower levels of government. Like if you looked at the number of people who were working in like tax administration, then of course there was an immediate jump from one fiscal year to the next, because those basically were moved over wholesale. At the national level, I think if you look at the National Ministry of Finance, there are probably not that many people who found their way over. And for technical reasons, for questions of qualifications and so on, and because the only reason why people were moved out of government altogether with a not so golden handshake was because they were found to be politically compromised, because they were working for state security, were found to be involved in sort of political crimes and so on. And of course, the closer to the top you get, the higher the likelihood that somebody would have been tainted and would have been moved out. But what's important here is more that even in a civil service system that to this day is a segmented civil service system, now 70 or 60% of the Ministry of Finance technically could go off and, enter the judicial system, and because by their training, they're qualified as judges. That's not quite the case anymore, because the proportion of lawyers in the senior civil service has come down. You are now, even people such as economists are now allowed into the sacred halls of the public finance function, and people with other social science degrees as well. But this is a very, very different world, of course, from the type of civil service system that you find, for instance, in the UK. I'm going to jump over this because I find this very interesting, but it's going to take too much time. If you're then digging into these individual functions to see where did those policy staff actually show up, then it is definitely an increase that is happening across the board. And it's mainly something that took place between the mid-60s, where the Keynesian turn finally sort of found its echo in the structure of the federal government. The idea that aggregate fiscal policy is even a thing for government that needs to be done in an organized way. That the macro fiscal department was sort of established as its own fully fledged department. All of those changes happened, but it's not that the policy staff are only economists who are working in the macro fiscal unit. Actually, far from it. Policy staff are increasing across the board, and a lot of them are moving into the budget office because the budget is the thing that holds the whole exercise together. And so a lot of policy work just runs up into the budget office, which again is something that in many countries nowadays, it's not uncommon to find this bifurcation where the macro fiscal unit becomes the interesting place to do policy work, where the economists and the people who might have a PhD or at least advanced training and so on go, whereas the budget office becomes the backwater where the old accountants see out their career. And that is sort of based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the budget office is supposed to do and what a macro fiscal unit is supposed to do. Because the macro fiscal unit, you can probably do that with very few people and still somehow get by. Whereas if your budget office is not keeping up with the demands of policy, then the whole government basically suffers. I'm getting ahead of myself there, of course. Now, a little bit more information about the UK. In the UK, it's quite interesting because there, from the 1970s onwards, you actually have a fairly flexible civil service. So up until, I think it was 1972, 74, with something called the Fulton Commission, if memory serves, that sort of moved away from this segmented organization of the civil service, whereby you are an administrative officer, and that is so the apex class of civil service officers into which you're recruited and are then sort of operating the machinery. You have that 1-to-10 ratio there. You have a ministry of about 1,000 people, of which maybe 100 are these highly qualified, very sort of elite civil service people, and then an army of supporting staff who are not allowed near those levers. Whereas today, Treasury has almost nobody who doesn't work on policy. So it went through that transition almost in its sort of purest form that you can think of, that the people in HM Treasury today who are not working on policy, and that number, depending on how you slice it, there's sort of 10-15% left. And that really is just the communication staff, the facilities, central function, HR, and so on. And that's it. And if you're not working on policy, then you're not supposed to be in the Treasury. And then you should ask yourself that question, like, why am I here? If my job isn't a policy job, go away and go someplace else. And but that change only properly got underway in the 1970s. And that is in part because public finances really only stabilized. This is my argument, by the way. I don't think that this is universally accepted truth, but also because it just so happened that a lot more flexibility was introduced into what used to be a very rigid and very conservative civil service into one which nowadays, you enter Treasury and there's a lot more merit-based, so fairly fast promotion that happened that in the German system you wouldn't come across very often and very much. But there are a lot of questions here that remain. There's a lot of work that still remains to be done in order to put this together into a bit more cohesive package. It's also by far not the only thing that is interesting about how fiscal and budget policy has evolved over the 20th and early 21st century. There are many more things that have been happening. There are many more things that are interesting about the way that finance ministries work. But I think this sort of change in the way that finance ministries look is something that I found to be sort of very interesting. And the more time I'm spending on that question, the more interesting it becomes for me. Final point that I want to make so that we can move to the Q&A is that I think starting out, I was very intrigued by this question of analytical capacity. What is the analytical capacity of the Ministry of Finance? How many people do you have there who have sort of technical qualifications that are relevant for fiscal policy and for these policy areas, so that they themselves can be the ones who can do basically research work in those areas? And this is a question that often comes up in a lot of countries, and I think is based on a misunderstanding of what somebody in that position is really supposed to do. Because the technical work, the research work, you can outsource in a pinch. As in you can internalize that, and in a lot of places the proportion of the research work that you're keeping in-house is high, but I would argue that is almost a workaround until you've settled into something that actually works better. Because if you are a policy worker, your specialization should be policy. Your specialization shouldn't be fiscal, and it shouldn't be health, and it shouldn't be climate change or any of those things. You need to be literate, as in being a qualified policy worker means that you're literate and you have the capacity to make yourself literate in whatever policy area you need to cover. But ultimately, your responsibility is to work the levers of government. That's what you gain experience in, and that's what you train in. As soon as you become somebody who is a technical specialist in one of these areas, then you lose the ability to talk to civil servants in other parts of government. And you might then as well think about whether some technical specialized agency is not the better place for you to work, because to sort out those differences is something that I think is that's easy to get wrong, and something that is very, very important as you consider how that journey of your institution is going to look like, and where you focus your resources and where you focus your attention. I'm very, very grateful for a level of patience in this audience that I'm just deriving from, as in my assessment of that, I derive from the fact that people were still nodding even as we're getting to the hour mark. I don't take that for granted. I'm also assuming that this is a small enough group that you would have felt embarrassed if you had overtly fallen asleep, but still. So thanks for your time. Looking forward to the discussion. Sorry, this went a bit long.